Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to be counting down the best books that I read in 2021. Previous years, I've usually divided these up into categories. I'd usually do a video based on the gothic horror books that I read. Sometimes I'd do a video on the fantasy books that I've read, and then I'd also do a video on classics. But this year, my reading has pretty much been skewed towards classics entirely, so I'm just going to put everything that I've read in this video. And it was definitely a hard video to make as well, because I would say that pretty much everything that I've read this year, I've really enjoyed. So there were lots of possible candidates, but I've narrowed it down to just a few books that I think stood out and are definitely worth reading. So first up we have The Waves by Virginia Woolf. The Waves is one of Woolf's most experimental novels, but also one of her most accessible. It tells a story of 6 characters going from their early childhood all the way up until old age. And each of them has a very distinct personality and a very different story, and in different parts of the novel they split up, have their own kind of adventures and experiences, and then at different points in the book they come together, and every time they come together their relationships have changed with each other. Although it's very experimental because each of these stories is told through monologues rather than through the typical way that you might tell a story, it's also quite an accessible book because each of the characters' monologue, it's just them talking. Woolf isn't doing the sort of thing that she has done in other books like To the Lighthouse, where she switches between characters sometimes in the same sentence. So even if structurally the book is quite experimental, I actually found it one of her easiest books to read, and that made me enjoy it all the more. One criticism that I have of Woolf's writing in some of her other books is that sometimes she can be a little bit too intellectual and cold, whereas I feel like in this book, that element of her work is still there, but she really gets to the heart of the characters in these stories, and I felt for all of them. They all feel like really well-rounded human beings with strengths and weaknesses, and all the rest of the things that you want from a good character. Also, I love the way that Woolf explores how personalities and how people change over time, and that's one of the really big themes of this book. Seeing how they begin as idealistic children just having fun in the world, and then slowly aging and seeing people around them die, and then aging themselves and realizing that their lives are, more or less over. It's got a beautiful melancholiness to it and also a tragedy to it that I just haven't found in any other book that I've read. It's also a book that's definitely worth rereading as you get older as well, because every time you reread it, you might relate to the characters in a different way. For me, I know that I relate to the characters when they're kind of at the peak of their youth, so around 28, 29, which is where I am at the moment, but I know that when I reread the book when I'm older, I'll definitely relate to where the characters are in other parts of the novel as well. So it's definitely a novel that's worth rereading, it's got a lot of heart to it, and it's just a fascinating story, and I love the way it's told, and it's definitely worth a read. Next up on the list we have Juliet by the Marquis de Sade. This was probably the most outrageous, disturbing, and in some places hilarious book that I read this year, and probably that I will ever read, because it's going to be quite hard to top a book like this. Juliet is the companion story to Sade's more well-known novel Justine, but whereas Justine follows the misfortunes of the virtuous Justine, Juliet follows the successes of her very evil, corrupt sister, Juliet. Now this book is 1,200 pages of long philosophical rants, usually atheistic, nihilistic rants, and also then horrible set pieces of very disgusting and depraved acts that sometimes make your stomach turn, and for those reasons it can be a very difficult book to read, especially given how long it is. And it's no surprise that it took me about 6 months to get through this, because I just couldn't, sit down and read this of an evening, every evening, so it took me a while to get through this one. But kind of like seeing a car accident when you go by and you can't help look at it, that's basically what this book is like. It always drew me back to it, because Sade has some very disturbing and somewhat interesting things to say about human nature, about politics, society, and the terrible things that people do to each other. I can't say I would recommend this one to everyone, and in fact, even if you were to read Sade's works, I wouldn't say you should begin with this one because it's just overwhelming. That said, it is a very interesting book, and if you're interested in the darker side of life, or you're interested in just seeing how crazy someone's mind can be or how crazy the human imagination can be, then you should definitely read this book because it's got a lot to offer in that respect. Just make sure that you don't eat anything before you read it because it is quite disgusting in places. Another book that I really enjoyed this year was Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. I wasn't expecting to fall in love with this book as much as I did because it wasn't a book that I chose, and usually I'm quite good at choosing books for myself and I'm quite good at knowing what I like, so when someone else recommends something it can be a lot more hit and miss because obviously I don't know if I'll enjoy it and I haven't worked it out yet. But I did really enjoy this book, and as it's on this list, it's one of the best things that I read this year. Steppenwolf tells the story of a young man who has this conflicted idea about himself. He thinks he basically has 2 personalities. One is his civilized self, and the other is this primitive, dark side of himself that he calls Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf is a very strange psychedelic story that basically explores the personality of Steppenwolf and also just human personality in general. The protagonist, like I said, splits his personality between these two sides, but the story basically encourages him, or his narrative arc encourages him, to explore the other aspects of his personality, to realize that he's not just limited between these two sides of a person. It's got some very psychedelic scenes in it, especially towards the end. There's just this really crazy dream sequence that I really enjoyed. It's a very ambiguous story. It's not really clear how much of it's real and how much of it is just in this kind of guy's imagination. So it's got lots of ambiguity going on. It's got some very interesting things to say, and I really enjoyed it. Next up we have The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. So this book was published after Hemingway died and was massively edited before it was published, meaning that some people complain that it's not a real Hemingway novel. But regardless of the editor tampering with the book and then publishing it, it's still just a fantastic book that has a lot of interesting things to say about gender. And if you're coming to Hemingway with the idea that he just writes about kind of, archetypal masculinity, then prepare to have your expectations subverted, because this book doesn't really do that, at least not in a traditional sense. It tells the story of this married couple who go to the continent on their honeymoon, and everything's fine until she decides, the wife Catherine, that she wants to get a haircut, and her hair gets cut like a boy's. And from this, she basically changes her gender identity. And the traditional marriage that they have starts to become a lot more ambiguous as the male, David, takes on a more feminine role in the marriage, and Catherine takes on a more masculine role. And this allows the novel to explore all kinds of ambiguities around rigid gender roles. This is still the only Hemingway book that I've read. Despite the fact that I really enjoyed it, I will definitely be reading more Hemingway at some point, but I really enjoyed it because it just, like I said, it really changed my idea about what a Hemingway book would be about. Because I was one of those people who thought that Hemingway would just talk about, very typical masculine things. And while he certainly does have that as a theme, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having that as a theme either, it was just interesting to see him explore something that I didn't really expect. I really would like to get my hands, though, on the original manuscript of this, which was, I think apparently there were 3 manuscripts, and one of them was around 800,000 words. So that's quite a lot of cuts that the editors made, because the book itself is very short. So it would have been interesting to, see that original copy and see what was cut from the book and how much more it explored, because although I do enjoy this book, it does feel like there's a lot missing and a lots of avenues that weren't fully explored or fleshed out. So it'd be very interesting to actually know what more Hemingway had to say on this topic. That being said, it's still a very interesting story, and it's proof that just because something gets tampered with a little bit by editors, it doesn't necessarily mean that the finished product isn't worth your time, even if you think it's not true to what Hemingway might have envisaged with it. I definitely recommend this book to anyone unfamiliar with Hemingway, or anyone who has a particular preconceived notion of what Hemingway does in his books, because I think it will shatter those expectations, and it's also just a great book, so that's another reason to read it, of course. And last but not least on the list, we have the only fantasy gothic horror book on the list, and that is The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. As I said before, it's been a classics heavy year for me, and I've not really read all that much outside of that, and what I have read I haven't really loved, but The Witching Hour is one exception, and is, in my view, a book that competes with all the other books that I've talked about. The Witching Hour is part of Rice's Mayfair Witches trilogy, and this focuses on the lives of the Mayfair Witches family, who are a family of powerful witches whose fortunes and misfortunes are tied to a strange, mysterious spirit called Lasher. And in the first book, The Witching Hour, we basically get a present-day storyline which follows Rowan Mayfair, who doesn't know that she's part of the Mayfair witch family at the beginning, and then as the story progresses, we get to explore the massive and complex history of the Mayfair witches, all the way, I think, from the original witch-burning days in the medieval period, up through the 20s in New Orleans, and then obviously back to the present day. What I love about The Witching Hour is that Rice basically does everything that she does really well in her writing. The epic, sweeping historical novel style, the complex, rich character work, and the very interesting and complex world building and mythology. She just does all of that here, brings it together into this huge, fantastic book, and in my view, I think it really is the best thing that she ever did. That's even including the books from the Vampire Chronicles. Rice manages to capture really well and make you feel like you're in each historical period that she writes about in this book, and all the characters really do feel like products of their times. Her vivid descriptions are all over this book, The Mayfair house especially is so vividly described that it comes across as a character in its own right. And that's to say nothing of the central story, which I also think is fantastic. And I found out recently that The Mayfair Witches was originally supposed to end on the cliffhanger that this first book ends on. And if you see my reviews of the following 2 books, you'll know that I lose enthusiasm for this series quite quickly. So it's kind of nice to know that actually Rice did intend for this to be just an ambiguous story with an ambiguous ending. And that makes me happy because it means I can go back and read this and just maybe pretend that those other 2 books, especially the third one, the second one isn't that bad, but the third one is quite bad. I can just pretend that that one doesn't exist. But the first one is just wonderful and definitely worth a read. And just because it might not end in the best possible way, the whole trilogy, it doesn't mean that it's not worth reading the first one. Alright, that's it for this list. Let me know down in the comments what were the best things that you read in 2021 and what are you looking forward to dipping into next year in 2022. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for updates for new videos. But that's it for this video, so Happy New Year everyone, see you all next time.